Cue up the air guitar for this one because we have Panama! Panama City's own Joselyne Edwards coming in on short notice, replacing Bethe Correira and taking on China's Mulan Wu Yanan. And Matt, this is a really interesting fight because for Wu Yanan, she came into the UFC at 21 years of age and lost her debut to Gina Mazzani, old danger Gina Mazzani. And that was 135 Gina Mazzani, not 125 beating Rachel Ostovich. So for Wu Yanan, she takes about a year off. She fights Lauren Mueller, and at the time, Mueller undefeated. She's now since lost 3 fights in a row. The first one was to Wu Yanan, and it was the fighter out of China picking up a great submission win in that one. So Wu Yanan, again, takes quite a bit of time off. She fights Mizuki, and in that one, loses a split decision. And it was a tough one. I saw arguments on both sides researching for this fight. But the one thing that we've seen from Wu Yanan since she made her debut to the fight against Mizuki, which I have to say was almost a year and a half ago, is the fact that she has really progressed with her overall game. Now, she does have a corner that you need to do your research on in Marlon Sandro, and I will assume that he's going to be here with her, you know, Bellator's own, and yeesh. But overall, from Wu Yanan, she can be quite volume heavy. She does have a ground game, but that's where I'm going to stop. Just by saying that she has a ground game. Yes, she has a win by submission over Lauren Mueller. No, does she have, by all means, a good ground game. Now, she was very, very early on in her career when she picked up her first loss. That one was to Yana Kunitskaya, and that was a fight where Yana just kept taking her down and rinse and repeat. I mean, Wu Yanan is definitely not one of the best fighters off of her back, near the mat, near the cage. That's not where she has a lot of success. She has a lot of success in open space when she's able to work her striking. If you look at her early career, again, 2014 and 2015, wins over Bo Meng, and now Bo Meng's a big deal with one championship. She was on the short list of honorable mentions for Women's Fighter of the Year from last year from Fight Night Picks. But again, it's been a weird career, and if you really want to dig into it, and you kind of have to at certain points, you look at Wu Yanan's overall record against the fighters before the UFC. They had an overall record of 2-6 out of 10 wins. Just 2-6. 6 of those fighters were making their debuts, and again, that's not counting the loss to Yana Kunitskaya. But out of the wins, 2-6, 6 debuts. She won 8 of 10 by finish, and 7 of them by knockout. Matt, I wrote a ton of notes on this fight, and I'll preview Joselyne Edwards, but can you give me a little bit of a sense of Wu Yanan, maybe some of the wrinkles and adds that she's had to her game since she's come into the UFC?
I mean, Gina Mazzani's beat 2 people ever in the UFC. Rachel Ostovich, who you know from fighting, and Wu Yanan, who, again, she was young in that first performance, but you look at the overall development of her skill set, she's been able to add some components, but again, beating Lauren Mueller doesn't really prove that much, and I'm gonna pat myself on the back a little bit. Lauren Mueller might have been undefeated going into that fight, but if you had watched the season of The Ultimate Fighter, coached by Gaethje and Alvarez, I forget the exact number, but they were the coaches. If you watch that, they talked about Lauren Mueller a lot, and then you go on to the Contender Series in which she made her debut. She didn't look that good, and the UFC gave her a contract, but it was one of those weeks, and I know you're gonna agree with me. They went into that whole week with a storyline of, Lauren Mueller, she's under the same management as a lot of people from the UFC. She trains with a lot of UFC fighters. We're basically just going to give her a contract if she wins. She was able to pick up the win on the Contender Series and had a very underwhelming run in the UFC. Wu Yanan's striking has gotten better, but when you look across at her opponent in Joselyne Edwards can throw big power. She has good kicks. She has great dexterity, kind of similar to almost like a Luke Rockhold with her kicks. And it's concerning for Wu Yanan because she is a fighter who, you look at her record, it's a nice looking record. You look at her age and you're like, wow, she's really young. But when you actually do a deep dive into her kind of mixed martial arts game, it leaves a lot to be desired.
So let's talk about the debuting fighter out of Panama in Joselyne Edwards, who spent a lot of time training in the States. She spent a lot of time in Iowa, where Robbie Lawler's from. And if you look at her overall body of work, again, that level of competition really wasn't there until about 2018 when she fought Brenda Gonzalez-Means. Yes, the wife of Tim Means, coming out of, NHB Fit over in Albuquerque. You don't hear from the gym very much, but Brenda Gonzalez you do. So she picked up a win with King of the Cage over Brenda Gonzalez. Looked great in that one, outstruck her and was able to get the armbar. But again, if you look at Joselyne Edwards for parts of her game, she has very good boxing. She has very good Muay Thai and Thai boxing. Her wrestling and her ground game is a bit of a question mark. You saw that in the split decision loss for the LFA belt back at LFA 55 against Sarah Alpar. And in that one, she went 5 rounds. She loses that fight. You might be down on Sarah Alpar based on her UFC debut against Jessica Rose Clark, and rightfully so if you want to be. But Sarah Alpar has really good wrestling and pretty good grappling as well. You didn't see it in that fight, but if you watched her tape on the regional scene, she did. So for Joselyne Edwards, goes back to the drawing board. I know of late she's been training in the States. Like I said, she fights Pamela Gonzalez with UWC at UWC 22 Total War back in July of last year. And I'm going to insert the finish of that fight into this one because I think you really need to see it. So you look at that finish by Joselyne Edwards, and here's a couple of things. She's always bigger than her opponents in most fights. She looks so much taller and so much fuller than a lot of the opponents that she takes on. Her kicks are great, and she mixes it up. She'll throw leg kicks. The one thing that I worry about, she can be a bit unpolished with some of her striking. She goes way too hard for some of the leg kicks and leaves herself exposed, and she goes hard in and blitzes with a lot of her strikes. It worked for her in that Gonzalez fight. But in a lot of her other fights, you see her having success, but it's against, lower tier opponents. So it's one of those things that I worry about. Still very young in her career at 25 years old. I think she has a very high ceiling. It's a tough one. I mean, it really is a tough one. She has a lot of great wins in her career, but it's really tough to tell what you're going to get out of her so far.
No, and I couldn't agree more. And that's kind of the case for both fighters. You have 2 young prospects who at this age and really at this stage of both their development, they're going to make big improvements between every performance. And for Edwards, I just think she has more room to grow in her game. And I don't mean she has more room to grow as in she's the worst out of these two. I just think when you look at her game and you look at her overall ceiling as an MMA fighter, her striking can get better and can get more polished, which is really going to make her, and this is a lot to put on her, going to make her one of the better strikers in the division if she is able to continue to improve. And this fight against Wu Yanan, I think it will be a showcase performance for Edwards. I know the odds are close, but I really like what you're going to get from Edwards. I like her striking, and I like her chances too. And again, this isn't something that people really talk about. She could get a highlight reel finish in this fight, and that's the best way to get your name out there in the public. There's nothing better for your career than either Dana White tweeting about you or Joe Rogan putting something on Instagram. And I really do think for Edwards, she has the kind of skill set that could get her a very impressive finish in this fight.
Edwards over on the IG hanging out with Pavel and the gals, getting ready for the Shevchenko sisters' last fight. You talk about the Pantera nickname. I know she had it before, but training with La Pantera and the other Shevchenko, the champion Shevchenko. But overall, stuff like that definitely will help your development. And with Edwards, it is tricky though. This is one that I would keep off my card. I think it's a bracket buster for sure. Right now, Wu Yanan a minus 150 favorite. Edwards plus 130. This fight was just announced yesterday, the day before we started taping. Friday, way ahead of the card. If you look over on Topology, limited sample size, 360 votes, 76% for Wu Yanan, 89% by decision. Again, it is a tricky one because with Wu Yanan, the one thing that she does a lot, and we did see that in her last fight against Mizuki, and we saw it a little bit in the fight with Gina Mazzani, but more in the Mizuki fight, she kind of planted her feet and she'll duck down, throw a right hand, come back up, throw a left hand, and she just kind of rinse and repeat.
Like a prime Mike Tyson.
She did it a lot, only not so much. It is a tough one to try and figure out. I mean, Wu Yanan, typically a busier striker, with Joselyne Edwards, a lot of power and fury. So it is tough. And again, I have to focus on one more thing before I give away my pick. You go back and watch the fights, and I say fights, against Moras Marcano Gonzalez. Fight 1, Joselyne Edwards gets submitted. Fight 2, she submits Gonzalez, but she's super aggressive, trying for the takedown, trying to submit Gonzalez. The other thing, too, and I said it at the start, Joselyne Edwards is bigger than a lot of fighters. Please, I implore you, go back and watch UCC 31 against Gonzalez. They look like bantamweight and atomweight. It's not even funny. And for Gonzalez, she's wearing full rash guard, full pants. We're just going in here for a grappling match. It was worlds apart. And I know, she already had a win, so it made sense to take the second fight. But we have seen these improvements in Edwards' game. So I will side with the slight underdog in Joselyne Edwards here. But again, this is one of the main fights where I wouldn't be surprised if Wu Yanan wins this fight. I wouldn't be surprised if she won a decision here, and if it ended up that Edwards won the first round and Yanan picked up the second and the third.
I mean, yeah, no, Craig just said both people can win. Really, any way you can win an MMA fight. Wu Yanan is the more proven fighter just because she's been in the UFC for a little bit longer. But again, beating Lauren Mueller is basically just beating a regional fighter. And Lauren Mueller was just never ready for the UFC to begin with. And just because their fight was in the UFC, I wouldn't really qualify that as a UFC caliber matchup between the two. I like Edwards. I like her ceiling. I think it's quite a bit higher than Wu Yanan's. And like you had said, it's hard to predict how good both these fighters are going to be on Saturday. But looking forward, I like the game of Edwards.
I just want to focus on one more thing before we go. The fact that Wu Yanan originally scheduled in this bout to be taking on Bethe Correira. A totally different fighter than Joselyne Edwards. Because with Rowdy Bethe, whether she's hitting herself in the head or not knowing whether or not to walk back to her corner while the fight's still going on, I think Joselyne Edwards is a tougher test just based on the fact that Edwards will throw with hands, with feet, and she'll throw them everywhere. With Bethe Correira, she's scrappy, but when she pushes a pace, it's a totally different fighter than Joselyne Edwards. It's a totally different skill set. So I think this can kind of throw a bit of a wrench in the plans of Wu Yanan versus fighting a fighter like Bethe Correira.
I love saying bad things about Bethe Correira, but how dare you? Like, Joselyne Edwards, we just said her record is extremely padded, but there's a few things about her game that we like. She's not better than Bethe Correira by any means. She's an easier fight than Bethe Correira, because Bethe, yes, you can make fun of her. Her fight IQ is not very high. She knows what to do in an MMA fight. It's my whole thing about basketball. You can be less skilled than someone else, but if you just know where to be on the floor, that counts for a lot. And Bethe Correira is kind of the definition of that for an MMA fighter. She just kind of knows what to do and where to be. For Edwards, there's way too many question marks to make such a bold claim like that, but I do still like Edwards in this fight.
All right, Matt, we're both going with a fighter from Panama to get the win in her debut. Both of us going with Joselyne Edwards here, and really looking forward to the card. We have a lot of great fights. I know there's a lot of big ones to preview. You got Phil Hawes, Nassourdine, Imavov coming up next. Punahele, Soriano, Dusko, Todorovic. So you're going to want to keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, Matt. As we always say, let's get into it.